Hello, everyone tuning in today. Great to have you with us. Let me start with a statement. Digital sovereignty is no longer about geography. It's about control. Now, I don't expect everyone watching this video today to agree with that yet, but by the end of the next 20 minutes, I'll hope you understand why I believe it to be true. I'm Andrew Murray. I'm Chief Customer Officer at Tyke. For those of you who don't know us, we've spent the last decade helping organizations manage their APIs and more recently manage AI and AI agents. When I joined Tyke 10 years ago, there were only a handful of us. We had an open source gateway, a lot of ambition, and a slightly unrealistic belief that we could compete with the biggest names in enterprise software. As it turns out, we managed to do pretty well. But the interesting part isn't our story. It's that we've had a front row seat to one of the biggest shifts in enterprise technology over the last decade. We've watched organizations move from running software themselves to consuming software as a service. And honestly, it made a huge amount of sense. SaaS solved some real problems. It was easier to deploy, easier to operate, usually cheaper, automatic updates, better security. And for many organizations, the SaaS provider could also operate that software better than they could themselves. At the same time, organizations wanted to move faster, launch new services, improve digital experiences, do more with the same teams. SaaS wasn't just an option. For many organizations, it became the obvious choice. The original SaaS pitch was pretty simple. You'll save money on servers. And for a while, that was true. But over time, something changed. Servers became cheaper. Cloud providers drove infrastructure costs down. Infrastructure wasn't the expensive part anymore. Operations were. Security, compliance, keeping systems patched, keeping them available. That's what SaaS really solved. I remember one CIO saying to me, I don't want fewer servers. I want fewer things for my team to operate. And I thought that summed it up perfectly. SaaS wasn't just outsourcing infrastructure, it was outsourcing operations. Once organizations became comfortable with the cloud, the next step felt obvious. The journey looks something like this. First, move workloads from on-premise into AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud. Cloud became the new normal. Before long, organizations started asking, why are we still running this software ourselves? If somebody else can run it more efficiently, keep it patched, scale it, upgrade it, why wouldn't we use SaaS? At the time, it made perfect sense. Every step reduced operational burden. Every step removed another thing for internal teams to manage. And I'm guessing many of you watching today have lived through exactly that journey. So the people viewing, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. Have a think. Of all the software your company uses today, do you think the majority is delivered as a SaaS? When I asked the room at API Days Munich, there were quite a few people putting their hands up to say this is the case. Now, a second question. Do you think 5 years from now, most of your organization's AI workload will be delivered as a SaaS? At API Days Munich, there were fewer people with their hand up for this question because those two answers don't quite line up. And I think that tells us something important. I've noticed something over the last couple of years. For most of the last decade, the question was, should we use SaaS? Today, I'm hearing a very different question. What should we not use SaaS for? I think that's the beginning of what I'd call the SaaS hangover. SaaS solved so many problems that for a while, we started using it for almost everything. And now we're beginning to rediscover where the trade-offs are. At Tyke, we're starting to see increasing demand for self-hosted deployments, no call home architecture, predictable licensing, more resilience, better disaster recovery, and greater control. At one end of the spectrum, some big banks we work with for API management still use IBM S390X mainframes for critical systems. Now, I should acknowledge this may in part be self-selecting. Tyke is well known for its open source gateway and its self-managed software. But nevertheless, we're seeing enough examples that it feels like something is changing. So the obvious question becomes, what changed? I think three things changed. The first was geopolitics. In diplomatic terms, let's just say recent events have accelerated concerns about strategic dependence on a single country. The second was regulation. The Cloud Act is probably the best known example, and I'll come back to that shortly. And then AI arrived. Suddenly, organizations weren't just sourcing infrastructure, they were outsourcing access to their knowledge, their intellectual property, and their decision-making. Three different drivers, one common concern. Dependency is no longer just a consequence of technology decisions. It's becoming a risk that organizations actively manage. For years, the question was, where is my data? Today, I think the question has become, who controls it? And that question really comes down to one word, sovereignty. We use that word a lot, but what does it actually mean? Highest authority, independent, autonomous, self-governing. Notice, none of those words mention geography. They're all about control. Data sovereignty is where the conversation started, but I don't think it's where it ends. Data is only one piece of the puzzle. Today, the conversation is really about digital sovereignty. And digital sovereignty is really about one thing, control. Who controls the infrastructure? Who controls access? And whose laws apply? Because if somebody else controls those things, how sovereign are you really? One of the biggest misconceptions is that people assume location equals control. It doesn't. Your data can be sitting in Frankfurt while the company operating that service sits under another country's jurisdiction. Location is a technical property. Control is a legal property. And probably the best known example of that is the Cloud Act. The Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act, which was passed in the United States in 2018. It established that a US provider can be compelled to provide access to data under its control, regardless of where the data is physically stored. And that's why control matters so much, because before the Cloud Act, the question was, where is the data stored? And after the Cloud Act, the more important question became, who controls the service? That's a subtle shift, but it changes the conversation completely. Here in Europe, we spent years focusing on GDPR, privacy, and data residency, making sure data stays within our borders. But the Cloud Act and now the EU AI Act means organizations are starting to ask a different question. Not just where is my data, but who ultimately has legal control over the infrastructure it's running on. Because you can have data residency without having digital sovereignty. While I was researching this talk, something caught my eye. In January this year, AWS launched its European sovereign cloud. AWS describe it as being managed, operated, and secured entirely within the European Union. Now, I'm not showing this to pick on AWS, although it is fun to do that. I actually think it's a really interesting market signal because it immediately made me wonder. If AWS already had regions in Europe, why build an entirely new European sovereign cloud? AWS obviously believes there's enough customer demand to justify building an entirely new product. That tells me something's changed. but it also shows how complicated sovereignty has become. Even if operations move into Europe, customers will still have questions about the software stack, maintenance, IP, legal jurisdiction, and ultimately, who controls the kill switch? Customers are asking different questions today than they were 5 years ago. This isn't just theory. These are conversations we're having at Tyke with prospects and customers every week. And interesting, they're not all coming to us for the same reason. The triggers are different. Commercial pressure, sovereignty, resilience, and increasingly AI. At first glance, they look like completely different conversations, but they're not, because they all end up pointing in the same direction. But I wanted to know whether this was just what we were seeing at Tyke or whether the wider market was moving in the same way. So while preparing for this presentation, I spoke with a Gartner analyst about digital sovereignty. She put it very simply: the winds have genuinely changed. And at Tyke, we're seeing that play out in different ways. Sometimes the conversation starts with cost. A customer sees a significant price increase from their existing API management SaaS provider and starts looking for something more predictable. But before long, the conversation isn't really about price anymore. It's about control over the roadmap, the operating model, and ultimately who controls the environment. We've worked with Dutch enterprises that have made a strategic decision to reduce their reliance on US hyperscalers and move to self-managed infrastructure. There's Chinese companies wanting to do business in Europe who are deliberately choosing European infrastructure because they don't want geopolitics becoming part of their supply chain. In Denmark, public sector organizations are actively moving towards open source to reduce dependence on closed vendor ecosystems. And with multinationals, the pattern is different again. They're designing isolated regional deployments so that one geography can continue operating independently from another. Now we're seeing exactly the same thing happen with AI. Organizations are happy to use AI, SaaS, for general purpose AI tasks. But when it comes to their most sensitive intellectual property, their customer data, their strategic decision making, they're choosing to run models inside infrastructure they own. Different reasons, same direction. They all want more control. Earlier, I asked you 2 questions. The first was about SaaS today, and the second was about AI 5 years from now. The answers weren't the same, and I think that tells us something. Instinctively, we already sense that AI isn't just another SaaS application. It's something fundamentally different. And here's why. Up to now, we've been talking about control. But AI changes what control means. With traditional SaaS, the question was fairly simple. Where is my data? Is it in Germany? Is it in Europe? Which cloud is it sitting in? AI is different because now we're deliberately sending some of our most valuable informations into systems that don't just store it, they understand it, they reason over it, they generate new content from it. And increasingly, they're able to act on our behalf. Think what we're putting into these systems: customer data, internal documents, source code, product strategy, financial forecasts. In many organizations, their most valuable knowledge. So the questions become very different. Who can access it? Who can analyze it? Who can act upon it? And perhaps the most important question of all, should this ever leave my organization? Because I think it's exactly where we're seeing the market starting to split. For general purpose AI, public SaaS is often a perfectly sensible choice. But for the most sensitive workloads, we're seeing organizations run those models on infrastructure they control. We've spent years talking about concentration in cloud infrastructure, but AI takes that concentration to a whole new level. Today, only a handful of companies are building frontier AI systems, and most of those platforms the world is beginning to depend on fall under US jurisdiction. We saw a reminder of that only recently when US export controls affected access to Anthropic's latest Fable and Mythos models. It's a good example of how jurisdiction can influence the services organizations rely on overnight. Now, this won't concern every organization, but it's becoming a much bigger consideration than it was a year ago, because this isn't just about market power anymore, it's about dependency. One way organizations are trying to manage that dependency is architectural. They're looking for a control point in between the application and the model. And that's where AI gateways have become interesting. This is from Gartner's overview of the AI gateway market. What stood out to me is almost every vendor on this list is headquartered in the United States. Just as with AI models, I'm not saying that's automatically a problem, but it does show that these questions don't stop at the model layer. They apply to gateways as well. And for some organizations, that makes AI architecture a strategic decision, because every AI request passes through multiple layers: the AI application, AI gateway, model provider, cloud provider, the jurisdiction. Every layer can change. Every layer can fail. Every layer can become a form of lock-in. That's why sovereignty matters. Not because organizations can eliminate dependency completely. They probably can't. But because they need to see the dependency chain clearly and decide which dependencies they are comfortable accepting. So, what's the cure for the SaaS hangover? Sadly, it's not this one. The cure isn't abandoning SaaS. SaaS solved some real problems. Cloud solved real problems. AI is solving real problems. The problem is where convenience hides the dependencies underneath. So before the next technology decision, I'd ask yourself 3 questions. What's the business risk? Is this just a low-risk internal tool, or is it touching something sensitive or business critical? Next, what dependencies am I accepting? Am I comfortable with the provider, the jurisdiction, the operating model, and the control I'm giving up? And finally, does this workload actually belong here? The point isn't to make everything sovereign. It's to know where loss of control would really matter and make that choice deliberately, which means there isn't a single right deployment model. Every workload has its own balance between convenience and control. Some are a perfect fit for public SaaS. Others justify much greater control. The architecture should follow the workload, not the other way round. Digital sovereignty isn't about eliminating dependencies. It's about choosing your dependencies. Maybe that is the cure for the SaaS hangover. Thank you.